It was a Saturday afternoon when I realized I'd lost control of my own story. The first clue wasn't some cryptic text message or a receipt in a jacket pocket, it was a laugh. A laugh that wasn't meant for me. Emma and I were hosting a backyard barbecue, the kind we'd thrown a dozen times before. Our friends gathered under the shade of the old oak tree, beer bottles sweating in their hands as the kids darted around the yard. I was manning the grill, flipping burgers, and chatting with my buddy, Jason, about the game on Sunday. Emma was on the patio, laughing. But not with me. Her laugh carried over the crowd like a sharp, silvery thread. It wasn't her polite laugh, the one she used when someone told a mediocre joke. No, this was the laugh I fell in love with, unfiltered and real, the sound she made when something truly delighted her. And it was directed at Mark. Mark, our new neighbor. Mark, with his perfect white teeth and his habit of calling me buddy like we were in some sitcom. He had his sleeves rolled up, leaning toward Emma with an intensity that set my teeth on edge. I didn't know whether I wanted to punch him or tell him to back off with a smile. But what stuck with me wasn't Mark, it was her. The way she tilted her head, the way her eyes sparkled, like she was someone else entirely. Someone I didn't know. "Hey, Dan, you all right there?" Jason's voice snapped me back, and I realized I'd been holding the spatula midair, a burger patty sizzling and forgotten on the grill. Yeah, just zoned out for a second," I muttered, flipping the meat. But my focus was gone. My eyes kept drifting back to Emma and Mark. When she touched his arm briefly, a laugh spilling out again, I felt something tighten in my chest. The rest of the barbecue passed in a blur. I smiled when I was supposed to, refilled drinks, and pretended to listen to Jason's take on why the team needed a new quarterback. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying those moments between Emma and Mark, overanalyzing every glance, every gesture. Later, when the guests were gone and the kids were in bed, I decided to test the waters. Emma was in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher. "Mark's a bit of a character, huh?" I said casually, leaning against the counter. She didn't even look up. "He's nice. Good to finally have some neighbors our age." Nice. That's what she called him. Not funny, not interesting. Just nice. It didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. I just didn't know what. It wasn't until a week later, at the company gala, that the second piece of the puzzle fell into place. The company gala was Emma's favorite event of the year. She'd been talking about it for weeks, what she'd wear, who would be there, and how much she was looking forward to letting loose a little. It was the one night where the kids stayed with her parents, and we could pretend, for a few hours, that we were still the young couple who used to crash fancy parties instead of hosting PTA fundraisers. I didn't share her enthusiasm. To me, these things were a parade of shallow handshakes and forced smiles. But for Emma, it was different. She came alive in a crowd, mingling with ease while I hung back by the bar, nursing a whiskey and counting down the minutes until it was socially acceptable to leave. That night, she looked stunning, an emerald dress that clung to her in all the right places, her hair swept into a loose knot that left her neck bare. I didn't tell her. Not because I didn't notice, but because I was still stewing over the barbecue. It had been gnawing at me all week, that laugh, that touch. I knew how it made me feel, but I didn't know what it meant. By the time we arrived at the hotel ballroom, the place was already buzzing. Emma disappeared almost immediately into a sea of coworkers and clients. I grabbed a drink and did my usual routine, scanning the room for familiar faces while mentally prepping the small talk I'd need to survive the evening. About an hour in, I saw her. She was at a table near the dance floor, sitting next to Mark. He wasn't even supposed to be there, he didn't work for her company. But there he was, leaning in close as she laughed that same laugh, the one that wasn't meant for me. I kept my distance, watching from the edge of the room. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe he just came as someone's plus one. Maybe it was nothing. But my gut told me otherwise. A woman I didn't know came up to me, introduced herself as Emma's coworker, and started talking about some project they were working on together. I barely heard her. my eyes were locked on Emma and Mark. She was doing that thing she always did when she was trying to impress someone, tilting her head slightly, her lips parted just enough to look inviting. It was the way she used to look at me when we first started dating. The woman must have noticed I wasn't paying attention because she suddenly excused herself and walked off. I didn't care. I was too busy trying to figure out what the hell was going on. It wasn't until later, when people started drifting toward the dance floor, that I saw my chance. Emma was standing alone, sipping a glass of wine. I walked over, slipping my hand around her waist like I used to. She stiffened for a moment before forcing a smile. "You look like you're having a good time," I said, keeping my voice light. "Yeah, it's a great turnout this year," she replied, glancing around the room. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking for him. "You've been spending a lot of time with Mark," I said, trying to sound casual. Her smile faltered. "He's just a friend," she said quickly. Too quickly. I wanted to push, to ask her why her friend was here in the first place, but I knew it wouldn't get me anywhere. Not yet. Instead, I nodded and kissed her cheek. "I'm going to grab another drink. You want anything?" "No, I'm good," she said, already turning back toward the crowd. I didn't go to the bar. I went to the coat check, grabbed my jacket, and walked out the side door. I needed air, needed to clear my head. But as I stood there on the hotel steps, the cold night air stinging my face, I realized I couldn't just leave it alone. I needed answers. Mark's name had come up too many times in the past few weeks, Emma dropping casual mentions of him during dinner, like he was some harmless new friend. But nothing about it felt harmless to me. I walked back inside, scanning the room until I found him. He was standing by the buffet, chatting with one of Emma's colleagues. I waited until the colleague walked away, then made my move. "Mark, right?" I said, extending my hand. He looked surprised but shook it. "Yeah, and you're Emma's husband," I said, smiling tightly. His expression shifted slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Nice to meet you. Emma's talked about you." "Funny, she hasn't mentioned you much," I lied. He chuckled awkwardly. "Well, we've only met a couple of times. She's been helping me settle in, getting to know the neighborhood and all that." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "She's good at that. Very friendly." There was a flicker of something in his eyes, unease, maybe, but he covered it with another smile. "Yeah, she's great," he said. "You're a lucky guy." "Thanks," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Enjoy the party." I walked away, my stomach churning. Something about the way he said it, too smooth, too rehearsed. It didn't sit right. I spent the rest of the night playing the dutiful husband, keeping close enough to Emma to see her interactions with Mark but far enough away to give her the illusion of space. By the time we got home, I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night in my head. The next day, I made a decision. If Emma wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I started small, checking our shared bank account for any unusual charges, going through her social media for signs of Mark. It was all clean, but that only made me more suspicious. It wasn't until 2 days later that I found it. The receipt. It was in the glove compartment of her car, crumpled but intact. A hotel bill from 2 weeks ago, on a night she'd told me she was working late. There were 2 names on the receipt, hers and his. When I found the hotel receipt, it was like the world stopped moving for a second. I just sat there in her car, staring at the crumpled paper, reading and rereading the names. Emma Rogers. Mark Taylor. A room booked for one night, and not just any room, a suite. There it was. Proof. Cold and undeniable. Everything I'd been suspecting, everything I'd been trying to dismiss as paranoia, now had weight behind it. I didn't feel relief for finding the truth. I felt rage, humiliation, and a gut-wrenching sadness all tangled up into one unbearable knot. For a moment, I considered leaving the receipt exactly where I found it. Walking away, pretending I didn't know. But I wasn't that guy, not anymore. I couldn't unsee this, couldn't unknow it. If Emma wanted to shatter everything we'd built together, fine, but she was going to face me when I picked up the pieces. I pocketed the receipt, locked her car, and headed back inside the house. She was in the living room, folding laundry while some cooking show played on the TV. It was so normal, so domestic, that I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. How could she be sitting there, acting like the same wife I'd known for 15 years, while this was hanging over us? "Hey, Dan," she said without looking up, her tone casual, almost warm. I didn't answer. I pulled the receipt from my pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table in front of her. It landed with a soft rustle, but the sound might as well have been a bomb going off. Emma froze, mid-fold, her hands gripping a towel. Slowly, her eyes moved to the receipt. She stared at it for a moment, her face blank, before glancing up at me. "What's this?" she asked, her voice steady, too steady. "You tell me," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "Found it in your car." She picked up the receipt, her hand trembling just slightly. Her eyes scanned it, and I watched as her face shifted, confusion, realization, and then a flash of panic before she masked it with forced calm. "It's nothing," she said finally, setting it back down. "Nothing?" I repeated, my voice rising. "A hotel room with Mark is nothing?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, she looked me in the eye. "It's not what you think, Dan." "Oh, really?" I shot back, crossing my arms. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think." She stood up, her movements deliberate, as if trying to keep control of herself. "We had a work meeting that ran late. Mark and I both had too much to drink, so we decided to stay over instead of driving back. That's all it was." "Do you honestly think I'm stupid enough to believe that?" I snapped. "Emma, I've been watching you and Mark for weeks. I've seen the way you act around him, the way you laugh at his jokes, touch his arm. And now this?" "It was nothing," she insisted, her voice rising now. "I told you, nothing happened." "Then why didn't you tell me about it?" I demanded, stepping closer. "If it was so innocent, why not just say, 'Hey, I stayed at a hotel with Mark because of work'? Why hide it?" "I wasn't hiding anything," she yelled, her face flushing. "I didn't think it mattered because nothing happened." "You're lying," I said, my voice low but firm. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely afraid. "I'm not lying," she whispered. "Emma, I'm giving you one chance," I said, my tone deadly calm. "Tell me the truth. Right now." Her lips trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might actually come clean. But then she shook her head, her jaw tightening. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice cold now. "You're making something out of nothing." "Overreacting?" I repeated, my anger boiling over. "Do you even hear yourself? You've been sneaking around with him, lying to me, and you think I'm overreacting?" She flinched, but her expression hardened. "I'm not sneaking around," she snapped. "And I'm not lying. You're just being paranoid." That was it. The final straw. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the pictures I'd taken at the gala, the ones of her and Mark laughing, leaning in close, her hand on his arm. I shoved the phone in her face. "Explain this," I said through gritted teeth. She stared at the screen, her face pale. "He's a friend," she said weakly. "A friend?" I barked. "Emma, do you think I'm blind? I've seen how you look at him. And now I've got this," I gestured to the receipt on the table. "So tell me, how long has this been going on?" She didn't answer. "How long?" I shouted, slamming my hand on the table. Emma jumped, her eyes filling with tears. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Then what is it?" I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been screwing around with him behind my back." Her tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed. My stomach dropped. Those words confirmed what I'd been dreading. So it did happen, I said quietly, my voice shaking. She nodded, her face still buried in her hands. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The room seemed to tilt, and I had to grip the back of the couch to steady myself. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, she said, her words muffled by her hands. It just happened. We were spending a lot of time together for work, and I was feeling disconnected from you. It wasn't planned. I never wanted to hurt you. Disconnection doesn't give you the right to cheat, I said, my anger returning. If you had a problem with our marriage, you should have come to me, not him. I know, she said, her voice cracking. I know I screwed up. I don't know how it got this far. I stared at her, the woman I'd loved and trusted for over a decade, and felt a wave of disgust. Not just for her, but for myself, for not seeing it sooner, for letting it get to this point. This marriage is over, I said finally, my voice cold and flat. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with panic. Dan, please. Don't, I said sharply, cutting her off. Don't beg. Don't make excuses. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. But I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt clear-headed. The lies were out in the open, the truth exposed. There was no going back now. I walked out of the room without another word, leaving her to face the wreckage she'd caused. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of our confrontation, every tear that fell from her eyes, every excuse she tried to make. The truth was out, and it was as ugly as I'd feared. She betrayed me, not with a moment of weakness, but with intent. By morning, my anger had hardened into resolve. She had wrecked our marriage, humiliated me, and destroyed the life we'd built together. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this without consequences. If she thought she could cry her way out of it, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I got out of bed at 5 a.m. while Emma was still asleep. I left the house without a word, driving to the nearest coffee shop to gather my thoughts and plan my next steps. Revenge wasn't going to be impulsive or messy, it was going to be precise, methodical, and unrelenting. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. Lisa Bennett was a no-nonsense bulldog who had handled a friend's divorce last year, and she came highly recommended. By 8 a.m., I was sitting in her office, laying everything on the table. You want to file immediately? She asked after listening to my story. Absolutely, I said. But I don't just want a divorce. I want to hit her where it hurts. Lisa nodded, leaning forward. You have kids, right? Ellie and Max? Yes, I said. Then let's start with custody, she said. If she's been spending time with this Mark guy, there's a chance she's neglected the kids or put them in compromising situations. We'll dig into that. Good, I said, my jaw tight. Finances, she asked. She works freelance, I said. I'm the primary earner. I've been paying for everything: house, bills, the kids' school tuition. If she thinks she's walking away with half of what I've worked for, she's in for a surprise. Lisa smirked. We'll make sure of that. After an hour of strategizing, I left her office with a plan and a sense of purpose. But I wasn't done. Emma's betrayal went beyond the personal, it had affected every aspect of my life. I wanted everyone to know what she'd done. The next stop was the IT department at work. I had a friend, Mike, who owed me a favor after I covered for him during a major screw-up last year. I explained the situation to him, leaving out the more salacious details but making it clear that my wife had cheated on me with someone connected to her work. I need to know everything, I said. Emails, messages, anything that can prove what she's been up to. Mike hesitated. Dan, this is sensitive stuff. If it comes out I helped you, it could cost me my job. No one will know, I assured him. Just give me what you can. 2 days later, Mike handed me a USB drive. I don't want to know what you do with this, he said, looking nervous. Thanks, I said, pocketing the drive. When I got home, I locked myself in my office and plugged the drive into my laptop. What I found made my stomach churn. There were emails between Emma and Mark, starting out professional but quickly turning personal. Flirty jokes, compliments, and eventually, plans to meet up outside of work. One message from Emma stood out: "I need to feel alive again, and you make me feel that way." I forwarded everything to Lisa, who responded within minutes, "This will be very useful." But I wasn't satisfied with just legal leverage. I wanted Emma to feel the same humiliation and betrayal I'd felt. The next part of my plan was risky, but I didn't care. I gathered all the evidence, the hotel receipt, the emails, and photos I'd taken at the gala, and compiled them into a neatly organized folder. Then I wrote an email to Mark's wife, attaching everything. The message was simple. "I thought you deserved to know what your husband has been up to." Attached is proof of his affair with my wife, Emma. "I'm sorry you have to see this, but I believe honesty is the least we can offer each other in a situation like this." I hesitated for a moment before hitting send. I didn't know Mark's wife personally, but I figured she deserved the truth as much as I did. And if it caused problems for him and Emma, all the better. The fallout was immediate. Mark's wife replied within an hour, thanking me for the information and saying she'd suspected something but hadn't been able to prove it. That same evening, I got a call from Emma. "Dan, what the hell did you do?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "I told the truth," I said coldly. "Mark's wife just called him screaming," she said. "You've ruined his marriage." "Good," I said. "Maybe now he knows what it feels like." "You had no right," she yelled. "No right?" I shot back. "You didn't think about rights when you decided to cheat, Emma. This is on you, not me." She hung up on me, but I wasn't done. Over the next week, I started telling our friends and family what had happened. I didn't sugarcoat it, I laid out the facts plainly. Some people were shocked, others were sympathetic, but the most satisfying reactions came from her friends. A few of them called to tell me they'd had their suspicions about Emma and Mark but hadn't wanted to get involved. Her parents, though, were the real prize. They were old school, devoutly religious, and had always been proud of Emma for building a family. When I told them what she'd done, they were furious. "This is not how we raised her," her father said, his voice shaking. They called her immediately, and from what I heard later, the conversation didn't go well. Emma came home that night pale and shaken, barely speaking to me. But the final blow came when I handed her the divorce papers. I waited until she was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to eat dinner, before I dropped them in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice small. "Your future," I said. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. "You're taking the kids," she whispered. "Full custody," I said. "You can fight it if you want, but with everything I've got on you, I wouldn't bother." Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. She'd made her choices, and now she was going to live with them. "Dan, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll do anything to fix this. I'll go to counseling, I'll cut ties with Mark, I'll do whatever it takes." "It's too late," I said, my tone ice cold. "You didn't care about fixing things when you were sneaking around. Don't act like the victim now." She broke down sobbing, but I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. I left her at the table, taking the kids to my parents' house for the night. Revenge wasn't sweet, but it was necessary. Emma had destroyed our marriage, and I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. In the weeks after I served her the divorce papers, Emma and I lived in the same house like strangers. The air was heavy with resentment, guilt, and tension, and the kids were caught in the middle. Ellie and Max weren't stupid, they knew something was wrong, but I hadn't told them the full truth yet. I didn't want to drag them into the mess until I knew exactly where we stood. Emma tried everything to salvage some shred of control. She'd alternate between apologies, outbursts, and desperate attempts to talk. But I wasn't interested. She'd burned the bridge between us, and no amount of words could rebuild it. One night, she cornered me in the kitchen after the kids had gone to bed. She was wearing one of those old college sweatshirts she used to lounge around in when we first got married, like it was some kind of nostalgic peace offering. We need to talk, she said, her voice quieter than usual. About what? I replied, not bothering to look up from the dishes I was washing. About us, she said, taking a hesitant step closer. About the kids. About what happens next. I dried my hands on a dish towel and turned to face her. What happens next is up to the court, Emma. That's all there is to it. Don't do this, she said, her voice cracking. Don't shut me out like this. I laughed bitterly. Shut you out? That's rich, coming from you. You didn't seem too concerned about shutting me out when you were sneaking off to hotel rooms with Mark. Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. I was tired of her tears, tired of the excuses, tired of her trying to paint herself as the victim. I made a mistake, she said, her voice trembling. A horrible, stupid mistake. But we've been together for 15 years, Dan. Doesn't that mean anything to you? It did, I said sharply. Until you threw it all away. I didn't throw it away, she insisted. I was struggling, Dan. I felt like I wasn't enough, like you didn't see me anymore. And you think that justifies what you did? I shot back. Emma, I was right there. If you felt like something was wrong, you should have talked to me. Instead, you turned to him. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice rising. It just. Stop, I interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't you dare finish that sentence. You didn't just trip and fall into a hotel room with him, Emma. You made a choice. Over and over again, you chose him. Not me. Not the kids. Him. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse. I know I hurt you, she said quietly. But I still love you, Dan. I want to fix this. I shook my head, feeling a surge of anger rise in my chest. You don't get to say that, I said, my voice low and cold. You don't get to stand here and tell me you love me after everything you've done. Love doesn't look like this, Emma. Love doesn't destroy families. She wiped at her eyes, her hands shaking. I know you're angry, she said. And you have every right to be. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, start over. No, I said firmly. We can't. You made sure of that. What about the kids? She asked desperately. What do we tell them? How do we explain this to them? We tell them the truth, I said. Her eyes widened in panic. Dan, no. You can't do that. They're too young, they won't understand. They'll understand more than you think, I said. And I'm not going to lie to them to protect your image. They deserve the truth, Emma. They deserve to know why their family is falling apart. She stared at me, her face pale and drawn. I'll lose them, she whispered. They'll hate me. That's not my problem, I said bluntly. The conversation ended there, with her breaking down into sobs and me walking away. I went upstairs to check on the kids, who were both fast asleep, unaware of the storm brewing downstairs. The next morning, I sat Ellie and Max down at the dining table. Emma tried to join us, but I told her to wait in the other room. This was my conversation to have. Your mom and I are getting a divorce, I said, cutting straight to the point. Ellie's face crumpled, and Max's eyes filled with tears. Why? Max asked, his voice small and confused. Because your mom made some bad choices, I said carefully. Choices that hurt our family. I know this is hard to understand, but I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Your mom and I both love you very much, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure you're okay. Ellie wiped at her eyes, her lips trembling. What kind of choices? She asked hesitantly. I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. She broke our trust, I said finally. That's all you need to know right now. Max sniffled, his little hands gripping the edge of the table. Are we still going to live here? For now, I said. But things are going to change. Your mom and I are working on a plan, and we'll keep you updated every step of the way. The conversation was painful, but it was necessary. When it was over, I hugged both of them tightly, reassuring them that I'd always be there for them. Afterward, I let Emma talk to them. I didn't stay to listen. I didn't want to hear whatever version of the truth she was going to feed them. Later that night, she came to me, her face puffy and red from crying. "I'll agree to the divorce," she said quietly. "And to your custody terms. I don't want to fight anymore." Her words should have felt like a victory, but they didn't. They just felt hollow. "Good," I said simply. We didn't say anything else to each other that night. The battle was over, but the war had left its scars. The day Emma signed the divorce papers was quiet. No tears, no shouting, just the sound of a pen scratching across paper. She handed the documents back to me, her eyes hollow, and without another word, went upstairs. For a moment, I just stood there, holding the papers that officially marked the end of our marriage. The finality of it hit me hard, but there was no satisfaction in the moment, only exhaustion. The weeks that followed were a blur of logistics and awkward cohabitation. I stayed civil but distant, focused on making the transition as smooth as possible for the kids. Emma kept to herself, trying to stay invisible, like she didn't belong in the house anymore. And honestly, she didn't. Not in the same way. The first big step was splitting up our lives. The house was mine, her lawyer didn't even fight me on it, probably because Emma knew it was tied to my parents, who'd gifted us the down payment years ago. I wasn't planning to stay there forever, but it gave me stability while I figured out my next move. Emma moved into a small apartment about 20 minutes away. We'd agreed that the kids would primarily live with me, but she'd have every other weekend and one evening a week. The first time she packed a bag to leave, it was surreal. Max clung to her legs, and Ellie barely looked up from her book. I stood by the door, arms crossed, not saying a word. "Bye, guys," Emma said softly, crouching to hug Max. "I'll see you in a couple of days, okay?" "Okay, Mom," he mumbled, his voice thick with tears. "Ellie," she tried, her voice faltering. Ellie glanced up, her expression stony. "Bye," she said flatly. Emma's shoulders sagged, and she looked at me, almost as if she expected me to say something. I didn't. I just closed the door behind her, locking it out of habit. That night, after the kids went to bed, I sat in the living room, surrounded by silence. The emptiness of the house felt suffocating, but at the same time, it was a relief. For the first time in months, I didn't have to worry about pretending. The next day, I started to rebuild. Not the marriage, not the life I had with Emma, but myself. I threw myself into work, focusing on my job like it was the only thing that mattered. My boss noticed, giving me more responsibilities and hinting at a potential promotion. I welcomed it. Anything to keep my mind off the mess my personal life had become. But work wasn't enough. I needed to reconnect with the parts of my life I'd neglected during the marriage. I started running again, something I hadn't done in years. At first, it was just a way to blow off steam, but soon it became a daily routine, a way to clear my head and remind myself that I was still capable of discipline and progress. I also reconnected with old friends. Jason, my barbecue buddy, invited me out for drinks one night, and I actually said yes. It felt strange at first, being out without Emma, but by the end of the night, I realized I'd laughed more in a few hours than I had in the last year. The hardest part, though, was talking to the kids. Max was too young to fully understand what had happened, but he was clingy and nervous, constantly asking if things were going to be okay. I reassured him as best I could, but I knew the words only went so far. Ellie, on the other hand, was a different story. At 14, she was old enough to understand betrayal, even if she didn't know all the details. One night, after Max had gone to bed, she came into the kitchen while I was cleaning up. "Dad," she said, sitting down at the table. "Yeah?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder. "Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. I set the dish I was holding down and turned to face her. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged, looking down at her hands. "You've been different since Mom left." "I guess I have," I admitted. "But I'm okay, Ellie. Or at least, I'm getting there." She nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. I'm not mad at you, you know. For what happened? I know, I said softly. But I am mad at her, she continued, her voice trembling. She broke everything, and now we have to live like this. I walked over and sat next to her. Ellie, it's okay to feel mad. I feel mad too. But we'll get through this. You, me, and Max will figure it out together. She nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. Okay. The months that followed weren't easy, but they were steady. Emma and I communicated only when necessary, usually about the kids' schedules or school events. The first time I saw her with Mark at a parent-teacher conference, of all places, I felt an icy rage bubbling inside me. But I kept my cool, refusing to give her or him the satisfaction of knowing how much it still hurt. Eventually, though, the anger started to fade. Not because I forgave her, God knows I wasn't there yet, but because I realized that holding onto it was like carrying around a bag of rocks. It wasn't hurting her, it was hurting me. One day, Emma called and asked to meet for coffee. I almost said no, but something told me to hear her out. When we sat down, she looked nervous, fidgeting with her cup. Dan, I wanted to say I'm sorry. Again. I didn't say anything, waiting for her to continue. I know I can't undo what I did, she said. And I know I've hurt you and the kids in ways I'll never be able to fix. But I want you to know that I'm trying to be better. For them, if not for you. Her words felt genuine, but I'd learned not to trust her sincerity too easily. Good, I said simply. I hope, someday, we can be okay. Not together, but okay. I don't know, Emma, I said honestly. I don't know if we'll ever be okay. But for the kids' sake, I'll try. That was the closest thing to closure we ever got. Now, 6 months later, I'm starting to feel like myself again. The promotion at work came through, and the kids are adjusting to our new normal. Ellie's still distant with her mom, but Max is warming up to her again, which is good. They deserve at least one parent who hasn't completely checked out. As for me, I've learned that life doesn't stop when your world falls apart. It stumbles, it shifts, but it keeps going. And so do I.